Hi everybody, Terry Ryder from Hotspotting. Are you, like me, a little bit tired of media's obsession with what's happening with prices, particularly as they're reporting them in such a negative and inaccurate way? I certainly am. There are other important measures of what's happening with markets, and one of those important barometers that tends to be completely ignored by mainstream media is what's happening with rents, and as a corollary of that, what's happening with vacancies. There's some very, very positive data about that at the moment, mostly positive. In most of the capital cities of Australia, vacancies are low and getting smaller, and in most of the capital cities, rents are rising, in some cases very strongly. So let's have a focus on that for a change, because we're all probably heartily sick of hearing about what's allegedly happening with prices in the major markets of Australia. So, firstly, to vacancy rates. I'm referring to data from a very, very good information source, which I hope you all are aware of and use, which is SQM Research. That's the business of Louis Christopher, a very experienced and highly respected real estate statistician and analyst. So the latest figures from SQM Research dealing with what's happening with vacancies in our major cities. The latest figures show that the national average, the average across the capital cities, has fallen recently. It's now about 2%. A year ago it was 2.1%. So not a major change, but the change is in the right direction. But more importantly is what's happening with individual cities. In Hobart, the vacancy rate is insanely low. It has been for the last 12 or 18 months. It's currently 0.3%, which means there's hardly anything available. And I'm actually earlier today talking to someone who was actually looking to rent in that market and was finding it just extremely difficult to find anything acceptable at a reasonable rent, because vacancies are so low and have been for a long time. 0.3%, almost as low in Canberra, 0.6%. A year ago it was 0.8%, so the trend there has become even tighter. Quite amazingly, the ABC television, which never has a positive thing to say about the housing market ever, managed to come up with a claim in an item they did, a very negative one on the Canberra market, saying that there was an oversupply in Canberra. Well, the opposite is true. There is a very severe shortage, which is why the Canberra vacancy rate is below 1%. In Adelaide, the vacancy rate is just over 1%, 1.1%. A year ago it was 1.4%, so 1.4 was very tight, but in the last year it's got even tighter. Melbourne, a year ago was 1.7, and now it's 1.6. So overall, Melbourne's vacancy rate has tightened a little, and about 1.5%. Very, very tight rental market there. A couple of places where vacancies a year ago were above average, but have tightened a lot in the 12 months since. Brisbane a year ago was about 3.5%. Now it's 2.7. So a lot of that vacancy was in the inner city apartment market, and gradually that surplus of supply has been soaked up. So overall, Brisbane's vacancy rate is now below the 3-point benchmark and trending lower quite rapidly, because a month ago it was 2.9, in the most recent month 2.7, a year ago 3.4. So a very positive trend for Brisbane. And in Perth a year ago the vacancy rate was about 4.5%. Now it's just over 3%. So it's come down a lot, and it's almost down to that 3% benchmark. So Perth, a city where vacancies have been high for the last couple of years, now getting down to a point where we can expect to see some growth in rentals, and we're also seeing signs of a return to growth in prices as well in that market. Now, the two cities where the trend is a little bit negative, Sydney's vacancies have risen in the last 12 months. They're still below 3%. They're currently, according to SQM Research, 2.8%, but the trend is heading in the wrong direction for Sydney. Darwin, which is really the basket case market amongst the capital cities, it just can't seem to rise out of the trough it's been in for the last several years. Its vacancy rate has got worse in the last month, and in the last 12 months it's now 3.8%. But in 6 of the 8 capital cities' vacancy rates are low and trending down. So as a consequence of that, as you might expect, those very low vacancies and trending downwards, rents are generally rising. And it's interesting that the only markets that don't have a positive trend with rentals are the ones I just mentioned, where vacancies are heading in the wrong direction. That's Sydney and Darwin. But if we could look at apartment rentals, firstly, the national average is a rise of about 4.5% according to SQM research figures. So that's quite different to the average situation in the capital cities for prices. So quite a healthy rise as a national average. Now, included among, we're talking about apartment rentals at the moment. In Hobart, I mentioned how tight vacancies were there. According to these figures, in the last 12 months, apartment rentals have risen on average 12%. In Canberra, they've risen 6%. Brisbane, 2%. Adelaide, 2.5%. Melbourne, they're up 3%. Perth, apartment rentals about the same as they were a year ago. The only cities where there's a negative trend, and it's only slightly negative in the last 12 months, apartment rents in Sydney, according to these figures, down about 2%, and in Darwin down about 3%. And as I said, those are the two cities where vacancies are trended in the wrong direction. The other 6 capital cities where vacancies are trending tighter, we're seeing rental growth in most of them, including quite substantial rental growth in some, particularly Hobart and Canberra. So that's apartment rents. Turning our attention to housing rentals, according to SQM research, the national average is a rise of about just under 2% in the last 12 months. So again, the national average is a positive trend, but in individual markets doing a lot better than that. Hobart is, again, the tightest vacancies in the country, the highest rental growth, 9.5% growth in house rentals on average in the last 12 months. Canberra, as I mentioned, also very tight, vacancies below 1%. House rentals have risen on average 7% in the last 12 months. Then in Brisbane, with vacancies trending in the right direction, 3% rise and on average in house rentals. Similar in Adelaide. In Melbourne, house rentals are up 3.7%. In Perth, now remember I mentioned that Perth has been a down market with vacancies higher than comfortable and rents and prices going backwards. Well, the trend is now very positive for vacancies, and according to these figures, house rents in Perth in the last 12 months have risen 4.5%. So a return to a positive trend for Perth. And why I think these figures are so important is quite often we see rises in rentals before we see rises in prices. It's often a precursor to an uptick in the property cycle. So that's pretty good news for markets like Canberra and Perth and Adelaide, where vacancies are trending down and rents are rising. Again, same with apartments. The only cities where the trend with rentals is negative is Sydney and Darwin. With Sydney, it's only marginally so. House rentals down 2.5%, according to SQM research, in the last 12 months. But in Darwin, which is just in a pretty sorry state in terms of the Northern Territory economy at the moment and the Darwin property market as a consequence, house rentals have dropped a further 7.5% in the last 12 months. So mostly very, very positive. In 6 of the 8 capital cities, vacancies are trending down and in most cases are very low. And in those 6 capital cities, the trend for rentals for both apartments and houses is up. And that's all good news for property investors, not such good news for tenants. And just again, the 2 cities where the trends with vacancies and rentals are negative are Sydney and Darwin. So mostly positive news. And why aren't you hearing about it in mainstream media? Well, because it is positive news and they're very much addicted to telling us about all the negatives as they see it, but they're overstating the negatives, hugely overstating them. And they're just getting it wrong and they don't seem to care. So a little bit of good news for a change. Hope you found that useful and informative and a little bit better than you're going to get from any major newspaper around the country. That's it for now. Let's do it again soon. Terry Ryder signing off.